Jared Negrete. In 1991, a search team combing through the San Gorgonio wilderness in Southern California found a disposable camera lying about 45 feet off a hiking trail. The camera belonged to a 12-year-old Boy Scout who had vanished 8 days earlier on his very first overnight backpacking trip. The roll of film inside held 12 photographs, mostly landscape shots taken while he was still on the trail. But the final frame was different. It was a close-up of the boy's own face, just his eyes and the bridge of his nose, taken with the flash on. The kind of photo you take in the dark when you are alone and scared and no one is coming. That image is the last trace anyone has ever found of Jared Negrete. Nobody was paying attention to Jared before that weekend. He was an 8th grader from El Monte in Los Angeles County, a quiet kid heading into the San Bernardino National Forest with about 14 fellow scouts and a troop leader. The destination was the 11,500-foot summit of Mount San Gorgonio. It was supposed to be routine. Jared was heavy-set and not as conditioned as his peers, and by around 6 in the evening on July 19th, he had fallen roughly 1,000 feet behind the rest of the group as they pushed toward the summit. A Santa Ana firefighter on the trail that day noticed him cutting switchbacks and warned him to stay on the marked path. That firefighter was the last known person to see Jared alive. The troop leader, meanwhile, continued to the top with the other boys. When the group descended, Jared was not on the trail. The leader hiked roughly 12 miles through darkness to report him missing. Search teams mobilized at 7 the next morning and eventually covered a 130 square mile area of rocky manzanita-choked terrain using helicopters, sheriff's deputies, and rescue volunteers from across the region. Within 3 days, searchers found a footprint near the 10,000-foot level that matched Jared's high-top sneakers. They also recovered beef jerky wrappers and candy he had likely dropped along the way. Then came the camera on July 27th. The 12 developed photos told a partial story, but not the ending. The search was called off on August 4th after 16 days, with authorities stating his chances of survival were almost non-existent. The prevailing theory is that Jared slipped on steep granite and tumbled into dense manzanita brush, so thick that even trained search crews could not penetrate it. His family blamed the Boy Scouts of America and the troop's leadership for leaving a struggling child behind on terrain he had never seen before. It was his first trip, and he was alone on a mountain at dusk with no experience and no radio. The troop was affiliated with the LDS Church, and the question of accountability followed the organization for years, though no formal findings of negligence were ever issued. As of 2026, Jared Negrete has never been found. He is listed on the California Attorney General's Missing Persons Database and on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Over 30 years of amateur and professional searches have turned up nothing beyond that camera and those wrappers. The case remains open with the San Bernardino County Sheriff. Somewhere on San Gorgonio, a 12-year-old boy took one last picture of himself in the dark. And then the trail just ends. Sometimes, though, the wilderness does not take one person. Sometimes it takes an entire family. And what gets left behind is almost worse than the disappearing itself. The Cowden family. On the morning of September 1st, 1974, a young father and his 5-year-old son walked into a general store near Copper, Oregon, and bought a carton of milk. They walked back to their campsite along Carberry Creek in the Siskiyou Mountains. And that was the last time anyone saw Richard Cowden, his wife Belinda, their son David, or their 5-month-old daughter Melissa alive. So how does a family of 4 vanish between a camp stove and a carton of milk in broad daylight? Richard was 27, a former Air Force sergeant who drove logging trucks for a living. Belinda was 22. They lived in White City, Oregon, and had driven their 1956 Ford pickup to the mountains for the Labor Day weekend after a truck breakdown canceled their home improvement plans. Their basset hound, Droopy, came along for the ride. That evening, when the family failed to show up for dinner at Belinda's mother's house less than a mile from the campsite, her mother walked over to check on them. What she found was a scene that made no sense. The truck was still there with clothing inside. The camp stove was set up. Belinda's purse, her opened pack of cigarettes, the diaper bag, a dishpan of cold water, and that half-finished carton of milk were all sitting out. Richard's expensive wristwatch and his wallet containing $21 in cash lay on the ground. The only things missing were the family themselves and their swimsuits. An Oregon State trooper who responded to the scene later described the campsite as spooky, noting that even the milk was still sitting on the table. What followed was one of the largest searches in Oregon history. State police, the Jackson County Sheriff, Forest Service teams covering 25 miles of roads and trails, National Guard members, aerial infrared photography, and hundreds of civilians all joined the effort. A $2,000 reward was posted. Over 200 citizens petitioned Senator Mark Hatfield to bring in the FBI. But the Bureau declined, citing a lack of evidence of interstate kidnapping. For 7 months, the Cowden family was simply gone. 7 months later, on April 12, 1975, two gold prospectors hiking roughly 7 miles from the campsite found Richard's decomposed remains tied to a tree on a steep hillside. About 100 feet away, in a small cave whose entrance had been partially concealed with rocks, they found Belinda, David, and Melissa. Dental records confirmed the identifications. The autopsy determined that Belinda, an adult, had been fatally harmed by .22 caliber gunfire. The children, David and Melissa, had also been fatally harmed, with the autopsy findings described in court records as deliberate and premeditated. Richard's cause of death could not be determined because of the advanced decomposition. Investigators recovered a single .22 caliber round consistent with a Marlin rifle at the scene. Investigators focused on a man named Dwayne Lee Little, 25 years old at the time, who had been paroled just 3 months before the Cowdens disappeared. Little had previously served roughly 8 to 10 years for the 1964 assault and taking of the life of a 16-year-old girl in Springfield, Oregon. Witnesses placed Little in the Copper area on September 1st. His mother had purchased a Marlin .22 caliber rifle, and a component matching that model was recovered from his home, though the firearm itself was never found. A cellmate later claimed Little confessed to the crime. In 1980, Little attacked a pregnant 23-year-old woman near Portland, who survived by jumping from his moving vehicle. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. Little has never been charged in the Cowden case. He remains at the Oregon State Penitentiary and has refused to discuss it. The retired Oregon State Police detective who worked the investigation has said publicly that the case still haunts him. As of 2026, the Cowden family case is officially unsolved. And no, I am not making that up. A convicted violent offender sitting in prison, a cellmate confession on record, physical evidence connecting him to the weapon type. And still, no charges. Not then. Not now. Not every disappearance in the wilderness begins with silence, though. Some begin with a collision on a 2-lane highway and a woman who walked away from the wreck and straight out of her own life. Patricia Meehan. At 8:15 on the evening of April the 20th, 1989, a woman named Peggy Bueller and her father were driving west on Montana Highway 200 near Circle when they saw a car barreling toward them on the wrong side of the road. Bueller swerved. The oncoming vehicle struck the car behind her, driven by an off-duty police dispatcher named Carol Heights. Heights was shaken, but not seriously hurt. A blonde woman climbed out of the wrong-way car, walked up to Heights, stared through her as if she were invisible, and said nothing. Then she stepped over a barbed wire fence and walked into a field. Within 30 minutes, police traced the abandoned vehicle's plates to a woman named Patricia Meehan. So why was someone from Bozeman, 400 miles away, driving the wrong direction on a rural highway in Macomb County at dusk? Patricia Meehan was 37 years old, originally from Pittsburgh. 5'3" with strawberry blonde hair, green eyes, and a mild Eastern accent. She had studied early childhood development in Oklahoma City before relocating to Bozeman in 1985 to work as a ranch hand because she loved animals. By the spring of '89, something had shifted. Her landlord said she seemed agitated in the days before the crash. She had called her father in Pittsburgh saying she was stressed and wanted to come home. She had a psychologist appointment scheduled for the very next day, April 21st. After the crash, investigators found tennis shoe tracks beginning about 3/4 of a mile from the wreck site. They followed the prints for several miles before the trail vanished entirely. A 5-day search using horses, all-terrain vehicles, helicopters, and inspections of abandoned coal mines turned up nothing. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no belongings dropped along the way. Patricia had simply walked into the landscape and kept going. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. Patricia was not simply lost. Over the years that followed, more than 5,000 alleged sightings were reported. Most were dead ends, but a handful were considered credible. 14 days after the crash, a police officer in Luverne, Minnesota, observed a woman matching her description sitting in a fast food restaurant for 5 hours, refusing to give her name and claiming to be from Colorado and then Israel. The next day, similar sightings surfaced in Sioux Falls and Murdo, South Dakota. Then, on May 19, 1989, a confirmed sighting placed a disoriented Patricia eating breakfast hurriedly at a restaurant near her old neighborhood in Bozeman. She was reportedly talking to herself and looking confused. That September, a woman in Victor, Montana, picked up a hitchhiker who called herself Patty, said she loved horses, and then disappeared from a truck stop in Missoula. A year later, a transient woman arrested in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, was briefly thought to be Patricia, but fingerprints ruled her out. The case aired on Unsolved Mysteries on November 1st, 1989, which was Patricia's 38th birthday. The theories range widely. Some investigators believe she suffered post-concussive amnesia compounded by the depression and stress she had been experiencing. Others think she may have climbed onto a hay truck parked half a mile from the crash site and drifted away from her own identity entirely. There is also the possibility that the wrong-way drive itself was deliberate, a crisis interrupted by the collision. Patricia's father, Tom, and her mother, Dolly, both passed away without ever learning what happened to their daughter. As of 2026, Patricia Meehan is still missing. Her case is open with the Macomb County Sheriff and the Montana Missing Persons Clearinghouse. She is listed on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System as case number MP 8299. One woman walked into a Montana field and generated 5,000 sightings across 3 decades, and not a single one brought her home. The next case involves 5 men who drove into a California mountain range and generated no sightings at all. Just a trail of frozen footsteps and a trailer full of questions no one has ever been able to answer. The Yuba County Five. In June of 1978, a group of motorcyclists riding through Plumas National Forest in Northern California pulled up to a U.S. Forest Service trailer at Daniel Zink Campground and found the door ajar. Inside, wrapped in 8 bed sheets on a bunk, was the emaciated body of a man who appeared to have starved over the course of weeks. His beard had grown long. He had lost somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds. Several toes on both feet were gone to frostbite and gangrene. On a table beside him sat his ring, his wallet with cash still inside, and a gold watch that his family later said did not belong to him or any of his companions. The trailer had a propane heater with a full tank of fuel that had never been turned on. It had shelves stocked with military sea rations that were mostly untouched, and it had paperback books that could have been burned for kindling. The man had everything he needed to survive, and apparently used none of it. His name was Ted Wire, and he was one of 5 men who had driven into these mountains more than 3 months earlier and never come back. Ted Wire was 32. He, along with Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Gary Mathias, and Jackie Hewitt, were all from the Yuba City and Marysville area. 4 of the 5 had mild intellectual disabilities. Mathias, an Army veteran, had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia but was medicated and considered a success story by his treatment team. The 5 played basketball together on the Gateway Gators team through the Yuba City Vocational Rehabilitation Center. And on the evening of February 24th, 1978, they drove about 50 miles in Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego to watch a college basketball game in Chico. After the game, they bought snacks at a market near the arena and headed home. They never arrived. They were scheduled to play in a regional tournament in Sacramento the very next morning, and the team that won was promised a trip to Disneyland. These were men with plans, with something to look forward to. By 5 the next morning, their families were calling each other. When one of the mothers contacted the sheriff's department, she was told to wait 24 hours. 3 days later, a Forest Service ranger led deputies to Madruga's Montego, found abandoned along the Oroville-Quincy Road, roughly 70 miles east of Chico. The car was barely stuck in a snowdrift near the snow line at about 4,400 feet. It had a quarter tank of gas. The engine was undamaged. When investigators hot-wired it, the car started cleanly. Inside were empty candy wrappers, basketball game programs, and a neatly folded road map. The keys were missing. And somehow, it gets worse. A witness named Joseph Shones had been on the same road that night checking a cabin near Bucks Lake when his own vehicle became stuck and he suffered a confirmed heart attack. Around 11:30 that evening, Shones reported seeing headlights, hearing voices and whistling, and glimpsing a group of people in the darkness. He called out for help. The lights went out and the group went silent. By morning, Madruga's car sat in the spot where the headlights had been. Shones's account forms the backbone of the foul play theory. But it is important to note that his details shifted across retellings over the years, and he was known locally as someone whose claims did not always hold up. Over the following months, the rest of the story pieced itself together in grim increments. On June 5th, the remains of Madruga and Sterling were found on opposite sides of the road, roughly 11 miles from where the car had been abandoned. Both had died of hypothermia. Madruga's car keys were still in his pocket. 2 days later, Jackie Hewitt's father, searching on his own, found his son's remains about 2 miles from the trailer. Ted Wire, as described, was found inside the trailer roughly 19 miles from the car, by the road the men would have walked. Autopsy findings indicated he survived somewhere between 8 and 13 weeks before succumbing to exposure. The 5th man, Gary Mathias, has never been found. His shoes were discovered inside the trailer where Wire's body lay, while Wire's own shoes were missing. Some investigators believe Mathias swapped footwear with his dying companion and walked out in search of help. A 2020 internal Yuba County memo classifies Mathias as believed to be a victim of foul play and keeps the case open as both a missing person and homicide investigation. The fundamental question remains the same one it has been since 1978. 5 men left a basketball game on a Friday night with a tournament and a trip to Disneyland ahead of them the next day. They had every reason to drive straight home. Instead, for reasons no one has ever explained, they drove 70 miles in the opposite direction into the mountains in winter, abandoned a working car, and walked nearly 20 miles through the snow to a trailer where one of them slowly perished, surrounded by food and heat he never used. As of 2026, Gary Mathias is still missing. The case remains open. The fundamental question remains the same one it has been since 1978. 5 men left a basketball game on a Friday night with a tournament and a trip to Disneyland ahead of them the next day. They had every reason to drive straight home. Instead, for reasons no one has ever explained, they drove 70 miles in the opposite direction into the mountains in winter, abandoned a working car, and walked nearly 20 miles through the snow to a trailer where one of them slowly perished, surrounded by food and heat he never used. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Dennis Martin. In the summer of 1969, the United States government deployed roughly 1,400 people, military helicopters, FBI agents, and Green Berets across 56 square miles of the Great Smoky Mountains to find one person. That person was not a fugitive, not a downed pilot, not a foreign operative. He was a boy in a red shirt, 6 days short of his 7th birthday, who had walked behind a bush on a sunny afternoon and never come back. The search would stretch over 2 weeks, cost tens of thousands of dollars, and ultimately be judged a failure not because of its scope, but because of it. To this day, it remains the largest search and rescue operation in the history of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And it found nothing. It was 1969, and the Martin family was in the park for a Father's Day weekend camping trip. The kind of annual tradition that families build years of memories around. Dennis's father, Bill, his grandfather, Clyde, and his 9-year-old brother, Douglas, had hiked east along the Appalachian Trail from Russell Field Shelter to Spence Field, a wide grassy meadow sitting on the Tennessee and North Carolina ridgeline. There they met another family, also named Martin, with boys around the same age. The children played together all afternoon. At roughly 4:30 in the afternoon on June 14th, the boys hatched a plan to surprise the adults. They would split up, circle around a bush, and jump out. 3 of the boys went one direction and reappeared moments later, laughing. Dennis, wearing a bright red shirt, green shorts, and red and yellow shoes, went the other way alone. He never came out. Bill Martin began calling his name within 3 to 5 minutes. He ran roughly a mile west along the trail to Little Bald and back. Nothing. Without radios, Clyde hiked about 9 miles downhill to the Cades Cove Ranger Station, arriving around 8:30 that evening. That night, a thunderstorm moved through the area and dropped about 3 inches of rain, washing away whatever scent trail or footprints Dennis might have left. The search began at 5 the next morning and grew rapidly. By Dennis's birthday on June 20th, roughly 800 people were searching. The next day, the count peaked at around 1,400 across a 56 square mile area, including National Park Service Rangers, the FBI, Air National Guard, college students, firefighters, Boy Scouts, and a contingent of approximately 60 Green Berets. 2 Huey helicopters were brought in from Warner Robins Air Force Base in Georgia. But the search was so large and so poorly coordinated that it became its own obstacle. Searchers trampled evidence, covered the same ground repeatedly, and left other areas untouched. The official search closed on June 29th. A small follow-up by 3 park employees continued through September 13th of that year. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. That same afternoon, a family from Carthage, Tennessee, the Harold Key family, was hiking in the Rowans Creek drainage roughly 5 to 7 miles from Spence Field. Harold Key reported hearing what he described as an enormous, sickening scream. Shortly after, his son spotted what he initially thought was a bear. Harold identified it as a disheveled, unkempt man moving through the underbrush as if trying to avoid being seen, carrying something over his shoulder. Family members later said the object was red, matching the color of Dennis's shirt. The Key family did not learn about the missing boy until weeks later. The FBI and park rangers ultimately dismissed the sighting because of the distance involved. But longtime park tracker Dwight McCarter and Bill Martin himself later demonstrated that the hike from Spence Field down to Rowans Creek could be completed in about 90 minutes, placing an abduction within the realm of physical possibility. McCarter has also said that during the search, he caught the smell of what he believed was decomposition along the West Prong Trail, but was told not to investigate further. Years later, in 1985, a ginseng poacher admitted to having found small skeletal remains in Big Hollow, Tremont, roughly 3 miles from Spence Field, some years before. He had stayed quiet because he feared prosecution for poaching. When investigators searched the area, they found nothing. The official position leans toward Dennis becoming lost and disoriented, stumbling into a ravine or sinkhole and dying of exposure. Bears in the park were active and underweight that summer due to drought. But the Key sighting has never been fully explained away, and no physical evidence has ever surfaced to confirm any theory. As of 2026, Dennis Martin has never been found. The FBI released its file on the case in 2022, but the documents offered no new leads and were heavily redacted. The case fundamentally changed how the National Park Service approaches search and rescue, shifting from massive, unmanageable volunteer mobilizations towards smaller, trained response units. Before Dennis, the default approach was to flood an area with bodies and hope someone stumbled onto the right trail. After Dennis, the Park Service recognized that a search can be so large, it destroys the very evidence it is looking for. Bill Martin spent decades pushing for answers and challenging the official narrative, insisting publicly that the Key sighting was never given the weight it deserved. The Smokies gave up nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a bone. For a while, things actually seemed like the kind of mystery that only deep wilderness can produce. That sense of randomness, of nature simply swallowing someone whole. The next case challenges that assumption, because the woman who vanished was not a lost child. She was an elite athlete, running on a road she knew by heart, and she left behind a car that told investigators almost nothing. Amy Bechtel. Amy Rowe. Bechtel could run a marathon in 3 hours and 1 minute. She had competed at the University of Wyoming, trained through the Wind River Range at elevation, and was working toward qualifying for the 2000 United States Olympic Marathon Trials. In the summer of 1997, she was 24 years old, newly married to a rock climber named Steve, living on a street in Lander, Wyoming, that the locals called Climbers Row. She taught a youth fitness class, worked part-time at a gear shop, and was planning a 10K race she intended to organize that September. At least, that was the plan until July 24th. That was July 24th, 1997. By July 25th, her car was sitting empty at the edge of a forest road, and Amy Bechtel was gone. On the morning of July 24th, Amy left home around 9:30 taught her fitness class, ran a few errands in town, and stopped at a camera shop around 2:30 to discuss a local photo contest. She then visited Gallery 331, where a conversation with the owner became the last confirmed sighting of her alive. From there, she drove out to Loop Road in the Shoshone National Forest, about 15 miles southwest of Lander, to scout the course for her upcoming race. She was wearing a yellow tank top, black or blue shorts, Adidas trail shoes, a Timex Ironman watch, and her wedding ring. Steve Bechtel spent the day rock climbing near Dubois with a friend and returned to Lander around 4:30 that afternoon. By 8:15, he mentioned to neighbors that Amy was not home. Around 11 that night, the neighbors drove Loop Road themselves and found Amy's white Toyota Tercel station wagon parked at the Burnt Gulch turnoff near Fry Lake. The car was unlocked. Her sunglasses, a to-do list, and car keys were on the seat. Her wallet was missing. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere. The search expanded to over 500 personnel covering a 20-mile radius. The FBI took the unusual step of requesting satellite imagery from NASA, and even sought images from Russia's Mir space station, which happened to be orbiting over the region during the relevant window. Both sets of imagery came back useless, obscured by cloud cover. Mines, lakes, and the Popo-Aggie River were all searched. A watch recovered from the middle fork of the Popo-Aggie in 2003 was briefly thought to be Amy's Timex, but bones found nearby turned out to be animal. By July 27th, roughly 1,000 tips a day were pouring in. The search was called off after 8 days. The only physical clue found during the entire operation was a single footprint on Loop Road that appeared to match Amy's shoe. But it was lost before police could properly preserve it. A couple reported seeing a blonde woman matching Amy's description running near Fry Lake around 5 in the evening on July 24th. But this sighting was never confirmed to be her. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did, and the investigation slowly shifted from a search for a missing runner to a closer look at the people around her. A search of the home Amy shared with Steve turned up journals containing writings about power, violence, and harm directed at women, some of it referencing Amy specifically. On August 1st, FBI and state investigators sat Steve down and told him they had evidence connecting him to Amy's disappearance. That claim was a bluff, a pressure tactic. Steve ended the interview on the advice of his attorney, Kent Spence, and refused a polygraph throughout. His alibi for the day, climbing with a friend near Dubois, was corroborated. Phone records showed he made a call from the home at 4:43 that afternoon, undercutting a separate report from a camper who claimed to have seen Steve's truck speeding through the forest with a blonde passenger around the same time. Cadaver dogs and chemical testing of the home and of a nearby construction site where a tip suggested Amy might be buried under concrete, both came back clean. Investigators said publicly that Steve was not a central suspect, though they wished he had agreed to a polygraph. He has since remarried and remains in Lander. A second person of interest emerged years later. Dale Wayne Eaton, convicted in 2004 for the 1988 abduction and taking of the life of Lisa Marie Kimmel, was at one point the only inmate on Wyoming's death row before his sentence was later commuted to life. Eaton's brother told investigators that Dale had been in the Lander area around the time Amy disappeared and was known to camp along Loop Road. Eaton is suspected of being connected to as many as 9 unsolved cases across Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada between 1983 and 1997. A detective and an FBI agent traveled to interview him in 2010, but Eaton refused to discuss the case. Amy Rowe Bechtel was declared legally dead in 2004. Her case is active on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, A 2016 feature in Runner's World on her disappearance reportedly became that magazine's best-selling issue of all time. The case has been covered by Unsolved Mysteries, Disappeared, Forensic Files II, People magazine investigates, and John Billman's 2020 book, The Cold Vanish. Despite all of that attention, decades of investigation have produced no answers. As of 2026, the case is officially unsolved. Investigators have never recovered remains, and no one has ever been charged in connection with Amy's disappearance. The same thing that made Amy's case compelling, her fitness, her familiarity with the terrain, her strength, also made her disappearance harder to explain. If anyone could have survived alone in those mountains, it was her. The next case takes that logic and strips it down even further. A girl walks a short trail in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, and leaves behind exactly one object, a lens cap. Stacey Aris. On July 17, 1981, a 14-year-old girl from Saratoga, California, told her father she wanted to walk down to photograph one of the Sunrise Lakes in Yosemite National Park. The lake was about 1.5 miles from where their group was camped at Sunrise High Sierra Camp at roughly 9,400 feet of elevation. Her father, George, did not go with her. A 77-year-old fellow group member named Gerald Stewart offered to walk along instead. Gerald sat down on a boulder partway down the trail. Stacey continued walking down the granite slope toward the tree line at Sunrise Lake number 3. A tour guide and other hikers watched her enter the trees. Nobody ever saw her again. The only physical trace of Stacey Aris ever recovered was the lens cap from her small Olympus camera, found just inside the tree line where she was last seen walking. Stacey was 5 feet 5, about 120 pounds, blonde with blue eyes, and wore dental retainers and a gold ankle bracelet. She and her father were on day 1 of a 4-day group horseback and mule trip along Yosemite's High Sierra Camp Loop. They had departed from Tuolumne Meadows that morning, stopped for lunch at Upper Cathedral Lakes, and arrived at Sunrise High Sierra Camp around 3 in the afternoon. After settling in, Stacey grabbed her camera and headed for the lake. Her father had reportedly stopped her once earlier when she tried to leave in flip-flops and made her change into gray hiking boots with Vibram soles. Camp staff began searching that evening when Stacey did not return. The National Park Service launched a major operation the next morning. Over the following days, between 100 and 150 personnel joined the effort, including 67 Mountain Rescue Association volunteers, 3 helicopters logging more than 40 flight hours, and multiple dog teams. The search covered a 3 to 5 square mile area around the camp and lake. Aerial operations were scaled back by July 20th. Ground teams were reduced after July 22nd, and the search officially closed on July 26th after more than 8,000 person-hours and an estimated cost of up to $100,000. The dogs reportedly could not pick up a scent because of the dry, dusty granite conditions. And that was it. A lens cap, nothing else. The camera body, her belongings, her clothing, any trace of Stacey herself. All of it was simply gone. In over 4 decades, nothing further has surfaced. The theories are limited by the near total absence of evidence. A fall into a deep granite crevice is considered the most likely natural explanation, but no such crevice has been found. Foul play involving a member of the riding group has been discussed, but Gerald Stewart was 77 and considered physically incapable of overpowering a healthy young person and concealing any trace of what happened in the time available. Other hikers were on the trail that afternoon and saw nothing unusual. A contemporary newspaper article from the Fresno Bee mentioned possible family stress and a teenage relationship as potential factors in a runaway scenario. though Stacy's mother denied there was anything serious. Animal predation by a bear or mountain lion has been raised, but there was nothing to support it. Not a drop of blood, not a single sign of struggle, not a shred of physical evidence anywhere along the trail. The closest highway was 3 to 4 miles away, making an abduction by an unknown person difficult to carry out undetected, but not impossible. And no, I am not making that up. A girl walks down a trail in broad daylight with witnesses nearby, enters a tree line, and the only thing left behind is a plastic lens cap smaller than a silver dollar. The National Park Service case file on Stacy Aris is reportedly close to 2,000 pages. An extraordinary volume for a missing person case, particularly one with almost no physical evidence. Multiple Freedom of Information Act requests have been filed over the years to release the full file. Partial releases have contained nothing new, just standard search documentation and witness interviews. The file's sheer size itself has become part of the mystery. 2,000 pages suggests that investigators documented something, talked to people, followed leads, and built a record far beyond what the public has ever been told. Why the Park Service has been reluctant to share it remains an open question. George Aris passed away in 2003. Stacy's mother, Carol, died before him. As of 2026, Stacy Ann Aris is still missing. She is listed on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System as case number MP 34023 and on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database. The case remains classified as an open investigation by the National Park Service. Every case so far ends the same way. A person walks into the wilderness and never comes back. The terrain keeps its secrets, the years pile up, and the answer never arrives. But once, just once, the opposite happened. A man vanished in winter, was declared dead, and then turned up alive over a year later, 700 miles away, with no memory of anything in between. Stephen Kubacki. In February of 1978, a 23-year-old college senior named Stephen Kubacki went cross-country skiing along the eastern shore of Lake Michigan near Saugatuck and did not come back. A day or two later, snowmobilers found his skis, poles, and backpack arranged neatly on a trail at the St. Augustine Seminary. The skis were placed side by side facing the lake, about 8 inches apart, poles standing upright on either side, and the fully packed backpack sitting on top. From the gear, a trail of footprints led roughly 200 yards toward the lake's edge and stopped on the ice. Beyond the last print, there was nothing. No break in the surface, no disturbance, no indication of what had happened next. The tracks simply ended. Kubacki was a senior at Hope College, a private school in Holland, Michigan, studying languages. He had studied abroad in Germany, led a one-man protest at the campus library, and was considered more of a free spirit than his classmates. He was an experienced skier, familiar with the Lake Michigan shoreline. He had 9 credits left to graduate. Everything about his life suggested a young man moving forward, not someone about to disappear. Michigan State Police, the Van Buren County Sheriff, and the U.S. Coast Guard out of South Haven concluded that Kubacki had most likely fallen through the ice and drowned. Search dogs followed his scent to the end of the tracks and lost it. A spring search of the lake after the ice melted found no body. Hope College awarded him a bachelor's degree in absentia at its May 1978 commencement, and the college's public relations officer described the ceremony as mournful. Kubacki's parents, who later divorced, hired a private investigator from Grand Rapids. His brother urged police to check flight manifests to Germany, thinking Stephen might have fled to one of his former girlfriends overseas. Nothing turned up. Then came May 5th, 1979. roughly 14.5 months after his disappearance. Kubaki said he woke up in a grassy field near Pittsfield, Massachusetts, approximately 700 to 800 miles from where his tracks had ended on the ice. He was wearing clothes he did not recognize, including a winter jacket and jeans. In a backpack he was carrying, there were marked-up maps suggesting travel through San Francisco, Sacramento, Reno, Utah, and Chicago, along with homemade hitchhiking signs, a pair of brand-new glasses that were not his, a Wisconsin Marathon t-shirt, and about $40 in cash. He told a reporter he felt like he had done a lot of running. A divinity student named Ron Curtis later told the press that he had picked up a hitchhiker matching Kubaki's description on May 5th, who claimed to have flown from San Francisco to Boston and then taken a bus to Pittsfield. Stephen Kubaki was physically healthy when examined. There were no signs of prolonged exposure, malnutrition, or injury. He claimed complete amnesia for the missing 15 months. His last memory, he said, was the Lake Michigan shoreline. He told reporters he believed his memory loss was physical rather than psychiatric, and he declined mental health treatment. The mainstream medical explanation is dissociative fugue, a rare but documented condition in which a person travels, sometimes across great distances, and may assume a different identity, all while having no conscious awareness of doing so. It is an extreme form of dissociative amnesia and is recognized in the psychiatric literature. Though cases as prolonged as Kubaki's are exceptionally uncommon. Skeptics, including some at Hope College, believed he may have staged the disappearance, possibly to escape personal complications. There were reportedly multiple romantic entanglements, including girlfriends in both Germany and France from his study abroad period, and a female student at Hope who had threatened self-harm and left campus in the weeks after his disappearance. Suspicious phone calls to a family friend were also noted. His roommate, Mark Beyer, maintained that Kubaki would have told him if it were a hoax. The carefully arranged gear, the one-way footprints, and the complete absence of any body in the lake all support the idea that Kubaki walked away from that shoreline alive. The maps and hitchhiking signs found in his backpack tell the story of a long, winding journey across the country that his conscious mind apparently did not record. After resurfacing, Kubaki returned to Hope College, finished his degree, and went on to earn a doctorate in psychology. He became a practicing psychologist in the Pacific Northwest and authored an academic text. As of 2026, he maintains a personal website promoting a forthcoming memoir that frames his disappearance as one of history's last unexplained missing persons cases. Any new details emerging from that promotional material should be treated cautiously, as the single most reliable primary source remains the 1978 Michigan State Police Incident Report, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request by journalist Ellen Killoran. Stephen Kubaki's tracks ended on the ice of Lake Michigan in the winter of 1978. 15 months later, he woke up in a field in Massachusetts, wearing someone else's clothes, carrying maps of a journey he does not remember taking. He is alive. He has a career and a life. And he still does not know where he was. 8 people walked into the wilderness across 5 decades and 6 states. 4 were found. The rest are still out there, somewhere between the tree line and the silence. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.